delighted to welcome you to this session of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. The session is presented by the Hawthornden Trust. It is our pleasure to present today Greek Myths, a New Retelling, Charlotte Higgins in conversation with Arshia Sattar. Charlotte Higgins's new book, Greek Myths, a New Retelling, intricately captures the raw, magical originality of Greek myths. With original drawings by Chris Ofili, Higgins takes us on a journey to the myths of creation, Heracles and Theseus, Perseus, and the Trojan War, while giving female characters such as Athena, Helen, and Circe center stage. In conversation with Arshia Sattar, Higgins brings forth a fascinating new take on age-old narratives of love, magic, desire, and dispute. Charlotte Higgins. Charlotte Higgins is a chief culture writer of The Guardian and author of the acclaimed Under Another Sky, Journeys in Roman Britain, which was shortlisted for multiple awards, including the Samuel Johnson, now Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, and Red Thread on Mazes and Labyrinths, which was on Radio 4 Book of the Week and won the Arnold Bennett Prize in 2019. Higgins is a past winner of the Classical Association Prize and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. Arshia Sattar. Arshia Sattar has a PhD from the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago and has worked with Hindu myths and epics and the story traditions of the subcontinent for over 30 years. She has translated the Valmiki Ramayana from Sanskrit to critical acclaim and has also written 3 collections of essays, Lost Loves, Exploring Rama's Anguish, Uttara, the Book of Answers, and Maryada, Searching for Dharma in the Ramayana. She teaches classical Indian literature at various universities here and abroad and writes about books in numerous magazines. Please feel free to send in your comments by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, Greek Myths, a New Retelling, Charlotte Higgins in conversation with Arshia Sattar. Arshia, over to you.
Hello, Charlotte. It's nice to see you virtually. I'm sorry we didn't get to connect earlier, so we might have had a private conversation about the book. But what can I say? What a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the book. I've enjoyed the fact that it's taken me back to something that I haven't looked at for a very long time, to Ovid's Metamorphoses. It's also taken me back to some of my favorite plays, Oedipus Rex, Medea, the Oresteia. And it's lovely to experience the way you've brought all these sources together in what is called a new retelling. Yeah, I'm just going to briefly set up the book and then get you to tell us about certain things that you did. Charlotte uses the trope, the very common trope in Greek myth, of the weaving woman, the woman who is making a tapestry, the woman who is weaving a linen cloth. Laertes is her father-in-law's burial cloth, for example, in the Odyssey, and using various other pieces of art, such as fragments of pottery or later paintings, obviously all these other texts. She strings together a narrative in this book of weaving women who are weaving these stories that have become so familiar to us over the centuries and over the generations. And if I may say, though I don't think it's necessary, the justification for this for the conflation of weaving and storytelling is actually philological, that in many, many Indo-European languages, we have words for weaving and for storytelling that are actually related to each other very often from the same root. And in this new telling, basically, Charlotte, you've given us the entire corpus of Greek myth through many, many tellers, many, many women tellers, Andromache, Circe, Helen, many that are very familiar to us, Penelope, of course, and some women who are not so familiar to us. Is that a reasonable representation of the book, Charlotte, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you mentioned the linguistic aspect. That one of the things that I was keen to draw out in devising this particular containing device for the stories, this idea of the ekphrasis, the using a visual object as the conveyor of stories, which is a technique that's kind of embedded in Greek and Roman literature. But it does, one of the reasons for doing that is this close association linguistically between text and textile, which are clearly, you know, the same English words from the Latin root. And, that word in Latin, texta, also means some kind of structure. They're related in turn to the Greek verb tikto, which means to engender or to bring about, to produce or give birth to. So there's also this sort of, this very fundamental idea of producing or creating. And you just told me before we started this session that you have placed your laptop on your mighty Sanskrit dictionary. And those words are also, I mean, I'm no Sanskritist, but those words are also related to, I think, takman, the Sanskrit for child, and taksh, to make or weave. And forgive that I have mispronounced, no doubt. My Sanskrit, I'm afraid, is only of the yoga class.
Yeah, you're right. Which does not use words like takman or taksh. So, yeah. So
this is a very fundamental metaphorical connection, in other words, which I was, that was sort of very deeply part of the way I've decided to organise the stories.
Yeah, and it totally works. It's a great frame. It actually made me think about the absence of weaving metaphors in our stories, or even the trope of women weaving but we'll get to Hindu myths later. I think for our more general audience, it might be a good idea to tell us what a retelling is and how it differs from a translation.
Okay, so I think first of all one has to think of, what is a Greek myth and where do we find them? And the answer to that is Greek myths are the material of Roman and Greek literature, basically. So, almost every part of Greek and Roman literary, and also we're certain before that kind of orally delivered culture, has mythology as its kind of commonly understood material and language. So even Plato, who thought the stories of Homer were childish and ridiculous, he still uses myths. He still uses myths as analogies in his kind of wonderful philosophical writing. It's almost as if you cannot do without myths. Myths are everywhere. These stories are painted onto the crockery that ancient Greek people drank and ate from. They are carved into the pediments of temples outside which people made sacrifices, and they're absolutely in the plays, in the poems, in the epic poetry. They are everywhere, and they are ways of understanding and communicating about the world around, and also about, as it were, imposing mores and keeping people in check. They're not always, they're kind of wonderful, but they're not always especially benign, but they are about ways to understand the world. And so a retelling, there are no canonical versions of these myths. In other words, every single ancient author is using the bones of these stories and reigniting them, remaking them for the moment. So they exist in multiple different versions, which of course is a tremendous gift, because they keep on allowing themselves to be rewritten in the moment. Yeah. So I do follow, I follow the sources. I make my own very small tweaks and changes occasionally, which I own up to in the endnotes. But I do what in a sense every ancient author did, which was, use my own words and crucially decide what aspects of these stories I'm going to magnify and what I'm going to contract. So it's about expansion and contraction. It's about where you fix your gaze and what you think is important. In a sense, Aeschylus was doing that when writing plays based on moments in Homer, to take one scene out of Homer and make an entire play out of it. And Euripides did it in turn with the plays of Aeschylus. So there's this ongoing sort of handing down of stories that are allowed to be, in fact, they have to be malleable.
Yeah, I think Indian audiences will understand that perfectly, because that's exactly how our traditions, our storytelling traditions, our myth traditions, our epic traditions stay alive. And as you say, they're everywhere. They actually form another kind of cultural vocabulary. You can say, oh, Achilles, and everybody knows what you mean, or what you're talking about, or what you're referring to, or the kind of person that you're conjuring up just by using that name. And we have characters like that, Shakuni, who is a great villain, and it's a cultural shorthand actually, which like with Greek myth, like with your own work, there are a great many retellings now. It's almost as if each generation needs its own retelling, its own refreshment of a great story.
I completely agree with that, and I think perhaps from what you were saying, I know very little about, and it's a great gap for me that I must fill, my knowledge of the Indian mythological tradition. But in a sense, it sounds like it's much more readily understood. What I'm describing is much more readily understood in your culture, actually, oddly enough, than in a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition, in those traditions that are traditions, that have religious traditions of the book, where the book is sort of immutable. But there's no such, these are religious texts, of course, Greek and Roman, in that they describe gods, they describe the cosmological origins of the universe, but what they aren't is gospel truth. They're not sort of inscribed on them.
Yeah, literally and metaphorically, they are not the gospel truth. But I believe they are another kind of truth. I mean, I think the power of myth is precisely that it tells us something about ourselves, even though that thing was said, thousands of years ago in a world that we don't recognize at all. But I'm going to stay with the retelling thing a little bit longer, Charlotte, if you don't mind. I have a couple more questions. What do you think is the retailer's responsibility towards the original text or texts? As we now know, there are multiple versions of Greek myths, as there are multiple versions of Hindu myths. So as a retailer, what is your responsibility towards the so-called originals? And very important to recognize, the originals is in the plural. It's not a singular original, but there are multiple ancient sources.
Well, I suppose one way of answering that question is to say that my book is a compendium of stories from the ancient Greek myths. So it's in the tradition. It is in a tradition. It's in the tradition of authors like Robert Graves and going back to antiquity. In fact, that there were compilers of stories from the myths, as it were, in the ancient world. Pseudo-Apollodorus and Hyginus, characters like that, but also actually the great poetic compendia, including Ovid's Metamorphoses. So so what I am doing is actually rather different, for example, from a great flowering recently of novels based on stories from the Greek myths, right? So Madeline Miller's Circe, Natalie Haynes's The 1,000 Ships, Pat Barker's Silence of the Gulls. There's a great flourishing, I mean, that tradition in a sense has never gone away. I mean, William Golding wrote a wonderful novel based on the idea of the priestess at Delphi. They've always been Mary Reynolds. They've always been kind of amazing novels based on the material of Greek. Mythology, there's a kind of flowering, a really extraordinary flowering of that, particularly from a feminist perspective just now. my book is not a novel in that it does not take a character and create a sort of landscape of time, which I think the novel probably usually has to have in it, a landscape of time through which a character who is fully psychologically developed travels. Now, that's rather a limited description of the novel, but anyway, that's not what I'm doing. I hope that this book will actually be very useful to people as a kind of reminder and guide to some of the most interesting and famous and actually less well-known stories of ancient, from ancient classical literature. And it's very heavily endnoted. So what I want to do is to be the sort of entry-level drug, so to speak, to you know, the poems of Pindar, the plays of Euripides and Sophocles. So I point my readers back, and I'm very sort of straightforward about, you know, where I got it from, which isn't to say that it's not a creative process, because as I was describing a little before, there will be moments that I decide, well, this is what I consider to be the interesting moment in this story, which I've read, you know, maybe in a couple of different versions. And this is where I decide I'm going to decide to give a little more space and time. And because in the, you know, in the European tradition of modern, I mean post-antique, post-classical retellings, a lot of space, a lot of emphasis has been put on the idea of the hero, the virtuous hero who goes on a quest with his sword and very often kills a monster, usually a female monster, and receives the beautiful maiden.
The other one,
that is indeed an aspect of classical myths, you know, Jason, Heracles, Theseus. These are all kind of extraordinary, heroic, in inverted commas, characters. But in their modern 16th, 19th and early 20th century retellings, these characters are very consciously put forward as models of male virtue for good English or American young men who are going to go and do good service in the empire, to be honest. You know, and that is a very, very partial reading of these stories. So I was keen to sort of bring back, you know, draw back quite strongly from that kind of versioning of these stories, and to give them back their complexity, their sometimes nastiness and violence, and to return the place of women who are often completely elided from this foregrounding of ideas of male virtue. So it's a complex, you know, it was a relatively simple sounding question, as you know, with quite a complicated answer.
Well, I must say, I spent almost as much time with your notes as I did with your stories, because I was loving them. I really like, oh my God, this is as much work as the book itself. So I love the notes. I love the landscape you provide. And also, you know, if you're like a sort of nerdy pedant like me and you want to get to them, you can. And if you don't, you know, the stories stand very much on their own as well. So, multiple questions come out of your complicated answer, as they should, because I think these are complicated ways of telling stories. Initially, of course, in their origin, yes, but also in our representation of them for a contemporary world. So one of my questions is, these stories came out of masculinist patriarchal cultures, right? So the fact that women are consigned to, like, you know, weaving their pains and their triumphs and their jealousies and all of that is not accidental. Yeah, there's a reason women are placed where they are. And as women retellers, whether it's yourself or myself or Madeline Miller or, you know, Margaret Atwood or something, what are we doing by shifting this perspective? What happens when we see, as you said, these paragons of masculinist virtue from behind the loom, yeah, how does that get refracted for us?
Yes, well, it's an interesting question. I wanted to put narrative power in the hands of these female characters, which they had already been given, albeit in a less kind of radical and concerted way than I had given them. So, you know, I suppose, you know, all of this is absolutely implicit and in some cases absolutely explicit in the Greek sources. So it's partly about redrawing attention to these moments. I mean, for example, Helen of Troy, when we first see her in Homer's Iliad, she is weaving a great web, depicting weaving a web, weaving a web, depicting, we're told, the combats between the Greeks and the Trojans. And it's quite easy just to read quickly over that, you know, to move on to the great, you know, violent deeds of the quote unquote heroic men who are the focus, who are fighting over her. But actually what she is doing is absolutely extraordinary, right? She is making art about what is happening in front of her in the moment. And there is no character in the Iliad, with the possible exception of Achilles, who has that sort of synoptic vision and artistic will to do that. And it's a hugely important moment. And actually an early scholiast, an early commentator on a manuscript of Homer said, incredibly intelligently in my view, said, what the poet has done here has presented an analogy. I mean, sorry, this is a paraphrase of what the scholiast said, but anyway, what he, more or less what he said was, the poet has here given an analogy of his own act. In other words, the poet is writing the poem, and the poet has invented this moment of the female weaver weaving the art. So Helen is doing something very similar to what the poet himself is doing. I mean, that's extraordinary. So it's by forcing attention onto these moments where narrative control is given to female characters by the ancient authors, and really digging into that. And so my question to myself is, what would those scenes between the Greeks and the Trojans that, you know, if Helen was telling this story visually, what story would she be telling? Similarly, sorry, do go on.
Go ahead. It's your book. You go ahead.
No, I mean, you know, similarly, Penelope in the Odyssey you mentioned before, you know, she I mean, it's sort of terribly famous, you know, Penelope, in the absence, 20-year absence of her husband Odysseus at the Trojan War, and then his very lengthy journey back home to Ithaca. She's on her own for 20 years, and she is sort of besieged by suitors who demand that she makes a decision about which one of them she is going to marry. And she delays the moment of decision by saying, I will choose one of you when I've finished weaving my father-in-law's shroud. So she weaves by day, and then at night she unmakes this tapestry, unweaves it. And so she's delaying her moment of decision, but she's also delaying the end of the epic poem, which is a kind of extraordinarily powerful thing to do, actually. So it's a plot device. It's also a kind of self-preservation device from her point of view. It's an incredibly extraordinary and powerful act. And this idea of making and unmaking, creating and dissolving is wonderful. It's a moment of self-reflexivity, you know, the poet talking about art in his art, how the art is made. And as you say, Penelope, she's not letting the story end, no, because Homer is actually not quite done. So he places that onus onto one of his characters. And, you know, I find that actually epic narratives are so sophisticated, right? And what we call pastiche and postmodernism and all that, guys, just read the epic. They did it 2,500 years before. You are late for this train. You know? I totally agree with that. I completely agree with that. Yeah. No, it is absolutely amazing. And of course, you know, epic epic narratives have to have, I mean, I'd be interested in your take on what you would say about Indian epic, but certainly in the Greek tradition, that delay is fundamental.
Yeah,
You know, you can't make an enormous poem without a huge amount of strange delay. So either it's that Odysseus gets sidetracked for 10 years, that's kind of a big delay, or in the case of the Iliad, you know, Achilles, the hero of the poem, sits in his tent and sulks for over a third of the epic, right?
Well, one of our most magnificent mythological characters is the monkey Hanuman, who features in the Ramayana. And at the end of the Ramayana, he gets this boon: you will live on earth so long as your story is told. And so he becomes the teller of his own story everywhere, thereby making himself basically immortal. You know, that's a lovely boon, and that's a great trick. And it's I mean, you and I can go on about this, but let us go back to the book. So I have one question which I'm going to especially leave time for. So I might, but the question right now is, I was struck, and I think maybe because I was reading your book over this last week, you know, very almost exclusively, not entirely, of course. And let me just tell you, I've been dreaming about thunderbolts and, you know, I mean, the actions of the gods and all like that. But this time, reading it as I did, these multiple women narratives that basically take us through the corpus, I am shocked at how much rape there is.
Yes.
What are we supposed to do with that? How do we understand it? Every woman is raped, practically.
There is a lot of rape. There is a lot of rape, and it's a particularly, maybe it leaps out at us all the more because usually, or very often in translations and retellings, and even in educational settings, until fairly recently, this violence, sexual violence, was very often glossed over and referred to, for example, as seduction.
Yes.
I was pretty eager to not to tidy that up, you know. These are unpleasant, non-consensual events, and I was not minded to pretend that this was some kind of mild seduction. This is also very clear in European painting tradition, where you know, the Rape of Europa, for example, you know, subject of great paintings by many Renaissance Italian painters, but most famously perhaps Titian. You know, these are aestheticized, beautiful moments, and I think we know that that's not really true. And of course, as you mentioned before, I mean, these stories are coming out of a masculinist, patriarchal framework. I mean, they're being told by men. I mean, there are one or two female poets in antiquity whose works survive. I've certainly used Sappho, the greatest of them all, as a source, although she's not writing. I mean, she does use mythology because everyone uses mythology. She's not writing kind of epic length kind of mythological stories. So that you know, so I wasn't able to use her as much as I was able to use Homer, Euripides, but there are some poets who do have the capacity and imagination to see the world from the point of view of the other, and one of them, to me, the great, really unparalleled, I know, playwright of unparalleled greatness really is Euripides, because he does have this quality of turning questions, even within his patriarchal context, even within the context of plays that are being performed in Athens, we think to a largely male citizen audience. So probably were some women in the audience, particularly in restaging of those plays in other cities. It's a complicated question, but he's capable of inhabiting the sensibilities of many different kinds of humans, including women. And there's a particularly extraordinary play, Ion, by him, in which he has a female character describe her rape at the hands of a god. And I think it's an absolutely remarkable, it's a remarkable piece of imagining. And that was kind of a lodestar. But as a source, I mean, Ovid is very interesting. Ovid's Metamorphoses are absolutely full of rape. I mean, there are so many rape in that text in particular, and it's inevitably going to be a huge source for someone like me, because it is the greatest retelling of, you know, aside from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, in terms of its kind of teeming virtuosity as a repository of hundreds and thousands of different stories. Ovid is remarkable and bound to be an important source, but he is strangely interested in rape. And I suppose what, you know, in terms of what one does with that as a rewriter in the 21st century and a feminist, I was not, as I said, I'm not trying to tidy it away. The one thing I found myself trying to do was to reimagine those situations from the point of view of the female characters themselves. Ovid's habit, I have to say, is to see those events happening very much from the outside, and often in a highly pictorial way.
I loved your version of Leda and the Swan. I really, really did. Because, you know, I mean, talk about male gaze, right? And how many, you know, medieval and Renaissance painters just love this idea. And of course, it's a beautiful image because, you know, we think of the swan as non-threatening, but the way you've done it, I was frightened. I really was. So, you know, thank you for doing that, because one of the ways I think of dealing with these, you know, the sort of frequency of rape in all our mythologies is to not make it pretty. And as you said, to not talk about it as seduction, to remind people that these are acts of incredible violence, you know, emotional as well as physical. And anyway, thank you for that.
I'm so glad and happy that you like that Leda and the Swan. And I did spend quite many a long hour thinking about how terrifying swans are, actually. I mean, you know, swans are big, ferocious, kind of, and as you say, extraordinarily strange and beautiful creatures. But I was inspired indirectly, but also I'm a great admirer of the poems of Lucille Clifton, African-American poet, whose poems about Leda are extraordinary. And she uses Greek mythology as a way of thinking about the African slave experience, which is which is remarkable, and just goes to show to what service these stories can be put. You know, they can be by, and have been and continue to be, by poets and writers from many different cultural traditions put to service in really interesting ways.
Which leads me actually, thank you, Charlotte, to my next question, which is the recent pushback against classical studies in the US, certainly, from a person of African origin. From African origin. He's at Harvard. I want to get his name right, so I'll read it. Dan L. Padilla Peralta.
Yeah, I think he's at Princeton.
Princeton, excuse me. And he wants to rescue the classics from whiteness. And I loved also your introduction because, you know, I mean, I really thought, oh God, I could have written that, you know, in this way that we use the past to shed light on our present, to illuminate our present. But also that the use of that past can become very political, as it has become in India and in the US, and it becomes a way of keeping certain people in power and certain other people on the margins. And for somebody like myself, who in my own work is a classicist of a different kind than you, still a classicist, I would hate to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I completely see the reasons for the pushback. So how does somebody like yourself manage that discourse or that discomfort that we are all now asked to feel, and rightly so? Yeah.
I think by not being afraid of the discomfort. I mean, you know, I'm not, you know, what's happening in the academy in America, I think is a little bit different from what's happening in the UK.
Yeah.
I watch it with interest. It's clearly, it is absolutely bound up with American history. I mean, I suppose I agree wholeheartedly with the principle of please let's rescue classics from whiteness. I mean, you know, I suppose my personal perspective is, I suppose, of course, it's inescapable to see that classics as an education, as a tool, has absolutely been put in service of British imperialism and, you know, lots of unpleasant and regrettable, you know, malign things. Equally, Karl Marx was a classicist who wrote his PhD on pre-Socratic philosophy and materialist philosophy, and you know, I don't think he would have come up with historical materialism if he hadn't studied the pre-Socratic philosophers and he hadn't been a PhD level classicist. So I suppose I would hold on to the fact that the traffic has not been all in one direction, and that, you know, thinking with, thinking about, thinking against, thinking in relation to the classical world has also been of enormous use to people who are not white imperialists.
No, I absolutely agree. That thinking, we have to know the classical world to think against it. And I think typically we just believe that people who study the classics already come from a great place of privilege, because what's the use? And they're immensely useful. They are very, very useful texts to understand ourselves, to understand others, to understand what not to do, you know. So I think we just have to find new ways of, as you said, putting the classics to service in, you know, other schemes, other plans, other visions, other dreams that should lead to equity and equality rather than to continued injustice. Okay, here's my secret question for you. It's a little bit lighter than what we've been talking about before, but I know that you run the culture pages of The Guardian, and I, Ms. Higgins, happened upon an article about the archers, something about the archers. And how do you think our great narratives, our archetypes, as you would have us say, how are these inflected in contemporary popular narratives, like soap operas, for example, which I actually think are just epics, you know? But how do you keep those two things together? Or how do you use one to think about the other?
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much for noticing that. I wrote a very long article, just for our audience here. I wrote a very long article about the long-running Radio 4 soap opera, The Archers, recently, and then never to let some good work go to waste, I now write a monthly column about the what's been going on in The Archers. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they talk about epic, as you say. The Archers has been running for 70 years, and it's almost, you know, I mean, it's much more epic than Homer.
Yeah.
You know, it has this extraordinary epic quality of unfolding in the real time of its listeners. So that so the story follows real time. You know, if it's Tuesday in The Archers, it's Tuesday in real life, and a week later is a week later. I mean, in a way, it's a kind of remarkable avant-garde modernist experiment.
Yeah.
But of course, yes, it contains these mythological tropes, or tropes that we absolutely recognize from epic poetry, for example. You know, brother against brother. There is a tremendous amount. There are so many warring brothers in the Archers. These great sort of motifs about inheritance. So The Archers is set in a rural community. It's all about the idea of the farm, and it's all about the idea of who gets the farm. You know, in a way, Aeschylus's Oresteia has got nothing on this. You know, this is sort of real sort of fundamental. But these are, you know, it's also Archers, script writers, and have used all kinds of sources openly or, you know, unconsciously. But certainly they're very. Sort of one of the previous editors was quite sort of openly steal from Thomas Hardy and Dickens. So there was a sort of great sense of the English literature, the great novels of English literature, bubbling only just beneath the surface of the Archers. There were lots of stories borrowed from George Eliot and Thomas Hardy. So
well,
yeah.
If you're going to be on the air 70 years, you got to do a lot of borrowing, you know. And I love the way soap operas, television soap operas, I'm more familiar with. You know, like characters enter with a full backstory, and you find it out slowly but slowly. You know, and as you said, I mean, it's always fathers and sons. I love how actually, if we know the epics well, we find them everywhere, we see them everywhere, and always, always to our benefit, you know. I can't believe this, but we're out of time. I have very, very, very much enjoyed this session. I have many more questions for you, but of course, we'll just have to leave them for another time. So in this minute, I would like to thank you very much, not just for being here, but also for this very, very excellent book, which of course is upside down, reversed, but very good luck with the book. And thank you very much, JLF, and thank you, Teamwork, for holding this technology together. And who knows, if there is an in-person session, perhaps we shall see each other in real life.
In real life, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. I've really enjoyed it. And I'm just sad that I'm in London and not in Jaipur.
Yeah, well, next year in Jerusalem, as some people say, so next year in Jaipur for us, perhaps. So, thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte and Arshia, for providing a refreshing new take on age-old narratives in this insightful session. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us a series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that has been specially curated for you. Hope to see you in the next session.